Welcome to L&D Disrupt, the podcast dedicated to helping you overcome workplace challenges and prepare for the future of work today. I'm your host, Nelson Sivalingam, and I'll be speaking with the movers, shakers, and path breakers in L&D who are reshaping their organizations right now. Join us each week as we delve into the highs and lows of work in the industry to get to the real nitty-gritty stuff that you actually care about.
Welcome to another episode of L&D Disrupt Live, the podcast hosted by How Now. My name's Gary. I'm the content marketing manager at How Now. I'm also joined by our CEO and co-founder and the author of the now published Learning at Speed that you can pick up on Amazon and all good suppliers, Nelson Sivalingam. And then today's guest is Paul Matthews. Paul is a L&D expert, consultant, author, like we said, the returning guest on the podcast. But Paul, maybe while people are still joining, you can just give us a short summary of who you are and what you do.
Oh, wow. Short summary. Well, I'm from New Zealand originally, if you're wondering where the accent is from. And engineering is my background, actually, not so much L&D. And I ended up getting into L&D by accident. And I suppose I started looking at L&D with a slightly different perspective than many, because as an engineer, what I saw was a failure rate in L&D. In terms of getting done and getting people to do things differently and change. If I was an engineer building products or bridges or machines with that level of failure rate, I'd be killing my customers. So I sort of came at it from that, there's something wrong here. How do we fix it? And also, I guess Kiwis have a pretty typically, especially a farm boy like me, put a practical aspect, let's go do what works. Yes, research, data analytics are all great, but ultimately, let's go test it. Let's go see if it works. And if it works, let's just keep doing it, even if we're not sure why it works. It's kind of like, let's go and try things out. And let's think things through at a practical level in a way that means what we're talking about can be actually applied, rather than a bunch of theory that sounds nice, but, what do you do with that often? So I guess that's my background. And I ended up writing some books in L&D and speak at conferences and all sorts of cute stuff like that, develop some software, lots of different things.
Nice, really cool. And I guess that's a similarity between you and Nelson, as we spoke about last time, like coming at the angle of L&D from a different sort of perspective and not necessarily being part of the L&D world to start with, maybe. So, hopefully it's going to be a good chat today.
I was thinking, listening to you, Gordon, maybe there is a pattern with L&D outsiders and kind of being able to look at it from a kind of distance with a kind of fresh perspective to not coming from the people function. Maybe there's something in it.
Well, certainly the L&D people I've come across who are kind of in harness in an organization, the ones who seem to do well are often the ones who have come into L&D from outside the discipline rather than the ones that started as a youth, managing training room assignments on Lotus 1, 2, 3, because I have come across people in L&D like that. But I think that external perspective, certainly a business perspective, is a huge advantage to people in L&D. People have come from the business, they've managed a P&L, they've had some exposure to that whole operational side of things. And the budgeting and all the rest of it. It's difficult to really understand that if you've only really been in L&D your entire working life.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Cool. So like I said, we can sort of get into the main bulk of the show. So for anyone who's joined us for the first time, the format of the show really is going to be facilitating a great conversation between Nelson and Paul, but we'd also like you to come on and ask your questions or leave them in the chat if you don't want to come on camera and ask them yourselves. With every episode, we send out a recording in the sort of coming days after the episode, and you'll also be able to find it on YouTube and your podcast feeds as well. And if you want to tag us in any posts, obviously, How Now, Paul Matthews on LinkedIn, and use the hashtag Disrupt Live to let us know what you thought of the episode. Good or bad feedback appreciated. Maybe good feedback more than the rest.
It'll be really good.
Only good feedback, we've decided.
Okay, let's get into it.
So Paul, basically, everyone knows from the title of the episode that this is about how they can reboot training and L&D post-pandemic, and they would have seen on the event page there the assumption that we're in post-pandemic just because sort of we're riding the wave out of it isn't necessarily always true. So you wrote the ebook in 2020, you came back to revisit it at the end of last year and realized that actually a lot of what you were talking about was still valid. So you kind of updated it with more context and tips. Maybe if I give you a sort of summary of what I took away from the ebook, and then you can sort of correct me if anything I've got wrong or just add any more color to people. But essentially it was that COVID had caused so much change and disruption for how we work, and therefore L&D's role. People webinized or moved all their training online, and essentially that created a temporary measure. But even now, we're still seeing that people have all these quick fixes in place, so they weren't quite so quick after all. Is that a fair assumption?
I'm certainly still seeing that less and less over time, which is great. But some of the quick fixes that were put in place, effectively prototypes that were productionized, and they're still running in a full, more or less a prototype form. So I think a lot of those need to be, thought about again. What are we really trying to do here? How have things changed? I mean, if anything changes so fast, we've got to keep changing how we're doing things. But I think what the pandemic did for a lot of people was, it pushed them back to think again, which for some was a pretty major kind of disruption to their way of thinking anyway. Others were also were better able to deal with that. So what's happened, I think, is people have come out of the pandemic at different levels. The ones who kind of were very proactive and got stuck in have come out, I think, at a higher level of performance or input into an organization than those that were kind of almost sitting still, waiting to see if things would ever go back to normal. There are certainly L&D people who are still in that state saying, well, when is it going to go back to normal? Well, word to the wise, by the way, it ain't. Not going to happen.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, Nelson, is that something you've seen, maybe this idea that people are putting these measures in place, but then not necessarily always stopping to analyze how well they worked or whether they're sort of fit for purpose, context makes sense and all that stuff?
Yeah, I think what we saw with the pandemic and going into lockdown is essentially a knee-jerk reaction to, we need to continue services and we need to quickly hack together a solution. And it's almost the equivalent of putting on a Band-Aid. But it's not the sustainable solution for now. Hybrid work isn't a knee-jerk reaction to the pandemic. It's here to stay. And so it's no longer enough to have your hacky solution in place. And it's really to use the opportunity, like Paul mentioned, to ask those questions around the role that L&D plays in the organization, and to actually put in place a sustainable solution for the new world of work, rather than looking at it as a kind of temporary stopgap solution.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Paul, there's a quote that I wrote down because it was that good, but you said basically, we need to do, L&D needs to ask what we need to do today to help our people do what they need to do in the circumstances they're in today. And actually, like, if you'd taken that quote 20 years ago or 10 years from now, it makes perfect sense, right? We have to be in this constant cycle of looking at what's the context for today, what are the outcomes we want people to have, and how are we going to do it, right? So that question sort of exists separate from the ebook. It would work in any context, I guess.
Pretty much. I mean, really what I was trying to get at there was the immediacy of the thing needed during the pandemic. Is we had a sudden change in context. We had to respond to that and think about what do people need right now today, knowing actually, we should have known that actually next week they might need something quite different, or next month. So the rate at which we had to keep thinking about what people need. And I think over time, L&D has often got stuck because they do that sort of exercise of what do people need, and then they keep delivering that for the next 3 or 4 years without going back to reassess whether it's still fit for purpose in the new context. So, this change is a constant. It's unfortunately that's where we are now. We can't rest on our laurels with an existing design.
Yeah, and I guess there's no one size fits all answer to how often people should be doing this. But Nelson, do you have any thoughts about how often we should be, or any ways we can sort of stop and take stock of everything? How can we do that better? Is there a time period that it makes sense to operate in?
I think it's more continuous, and kind of building on what Paul said. There's the kind of top level, why does L&D exist, and the kind of mission and vision for L&D. But then with every learning experience and every time you're working on your L&D strategy, every time you're working on anything you're putting out to your internal customer is a moment to ask that question of why. And so I think it's more a continuous process of making sure you're only doing things not for the sake of doing it, because one of the things we can probably all acknowledge is no one now has the time to either be creating training or learning for the sake of learning. No one has the time to do that now, and it really needs to be tied to a purpose that matters within the context of the workplace. So I think that question is a continuous process of asking yourself, and I think it's a feedback loop where you put something out, you get feedback, and you use that feedback to ask yourself the question of, is this really still the thing that we should be investing time in? Are we going in the right direction? Is this the right purpose? So it's a part of that feedback loop, and it should be continuous.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I guess it works on two levels, the macro and the micro. Like every time you roll out like a small initiative and every time you sit down to look at the strategy, you kind of need to bring the two together. Speaking of learning, I learned something new reading the ebook, and that was about the grief change cycle. So for anyone who, like me, didn't know before, this is essentially a scale that you move through in times of change where you go through denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and then acceptance. Paul, have you noticed that really how quickly people move through this, or what stage they end up getting stuck in for the longest? Does that have an influence on how quickly people are able to develop new training and L&D initiatives that are sort of, like we said, fit for purpose, fit for context?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that work originated with a lady called Kubler-Ross, who developed this kind of cycle that people go through when they get exposed to grief, like the passing of a loved one or something. And it was interesting that people in the change, organizational change, got a hold of it and said, actually, hey, we go through that when we go through a change in an organization. There's a realization that what we've got isn't working or is lost, is past. And then people go through that same curve, more or less. And it's been adapted and used a lot in the whole concept of change. And I could absolutely see as the pandemic hit that people were heading into that cycle in L&D, from what was past, what was lost. And there was that first stage of denial and so on. Now, the thing with the grief, that change curve or the grief curve or whatever you want to call it, the amplitude of it will vary a lot depending on the person and the culture and their personal style and so on, and also the length of time it takes for them to go through it. Now, clearly, it has less disruption if the amplitude is lower and the time is lower or shorter. But there are still people in it that I come across in L&D now who are still saying and saying, oh, I wish things were back as they were. And to some extent, there's still a level of denial of the fact that the world has changed. As Nelson said, the hybrid stuff is here to stay. But the other aspect of that, by the way, is hybrid. Yes, it's here to stay. But I think also in L&D, there's a lot of focus on the white-collar people who can go and do hybrid stuff. There's probably more than half the workforce does have to turn up to work because they're hands-on and more blue-collar, if you want to use that expression. And I think we often forget that despite the fact there's a much larger number of people working from home at least some of the time, there's still actually the majority of the workforce going to work every day. And we often forget that. So we've got to be aware that, learning just hasn't, we haven't gone hybrid all the time for everybody. That's just not the case.
Yeah, I think as well, I guess that you make a fair point there that hybrid looks different to everyone, right? So even though we might say hybrid is now the new normal, well, that will change over time as well. Like hybrid might mean that some teams go fully like 1 day a week remote, some teams go 4, some teams start outsourcing to different parts of the globe, some teams go really narrow. So I guess it's like you can't just change for the context of hybrid. You have to understand that, like we said a moment ago, things are going to continue to change over time, and what the context of hybrid even means will change over time as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fashionable word right now. We love these fashionable words. So and it's not exactly new. It's just a word that's been used to describe a new way of working. But that new working model is certainly out there, and it does have an impact on how you need to deliver on L&D. It tends to drive things more into the digital realm, understandably, and it can make things a bit more difficult to get people back in the classroom. But I also think there's, there is still this idea of, should we go back to the classroom? Is it really fit for purpose? And in some cases, the answer is absolutely yes. There are some things you just cannot do outside of a classroom or outside of that collaborative and even multi-day classroom type approach, like, overnight and really getting together with a team and doing stuff. But there's also a lot of stuff that just doesn't need a classroom. And there is certainly classroom programs I'm aware of that were running before the pandemic, shifted onto virtual as a result of the pandemic. And the client, the customer organizations of those programs have said, hang on, we are getting far better results for all sorts of reasons from the virtual program. No way are we going back to the classroom for that particular initiative. For some other ones, they might, but not that one, because that one's obviously working better virtually. So we've got to be really careful that when we're going back to a classroom, we're doing it for the right reasons, not because people just want to get together because they are extroverts.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, maybe to jump forward a little bit in terms of the running order, because we're going to come to this point, but we talk about, like you said, face-to-face training worked really well for some companies in the past, but again, with the context changing, it's like what got you from A to B might not be what gets you from B to C. So even though maybe face-to-face did work really well for a company before or didn't work really well for them before, how important is it that they sit down again and say, well, how can we use face-to-face to train more intentionally so that it makes sense? So what's our starting point today and where are we trying to get to?
I think one thing I'd challenge there is face-to-face worked really well for companies in the past. There's not that many face-to-face programs work really well if you look at what came out of them, quite frankly. I'm not against face-to-face training, but I think the way it was done and the lack of learning transfer activities that were attached to those programs usually meant that the behavioural change outputs were pretty minimal, quite frankly. If you go to most people and saying, okay, we're going to run a face-to-face training program, what level of success do you expect? If you go to a manager, are we going to get 100% success? There's very few managers are going to ever say yes, because their history, their experience of sending people off to a face-to-face training program is that not a lot changes. Most managers would say, oh, we might get 20, 30%. It'll be a lowish figure. And so that's what managers tend to think of face-to-face training. And the reason for that was the lack of learning transfer activities wrapped around that training. Not that the training itself was wrong or bad or the wrong thing to do. It's just it wasn't completed. All the extra stuff wasn't done to get people changing behaviour. And if you think about it, behavioural change is the purpose of the training or the L&D initiatives, ultimately. I mean, if not that, what? I mean, I'd love someone to give me a better answer.
Yeah.
I was going to add, Guy, to what Paul was saying there. The idea of extremes tend to make great headlines. We often hear, death of the classroom, death of the office. We love to jump to one extreme and pit the extremes against each other, which make for great articles, but not necessarily what happens in practice. And going back to, again, what Paul said, I don't think there is a case of death to the classroom or death to the office. And often it's finding what is fit for your organization. And that might be different in different times and for different needs. And it's not a case of you make a decision and it has to be that way for everyone in the organization. I think we're now talking more about optionality and flexibility, and that applies for every aspect of the employee experience, including learning. And so I think we should often try to refrain from diving to dismissing something completely, especially when there is, some cases where it might be a great fit. Like, a classroom is a great environment to have collaborative social learning happen. There are some things that happen in a classroom that are difficult to recreate digitally with a multi-generational workforce. And so I think we should slow down in our kind of speed to go dismiss things.
Yeah. I think as well, like one thing based on what Paul said, Nelson, I wanted to ask you was, it's about who you send on this face-to-face training, right? Like Paul's completely now on the head that they're looking at how much learning transfer happens. But I mean, part of that is who are you sending on the course and why are you sending them on it? And that's how does that sort of play into the role of face-to-face training?
Yeah, I think where that starts from is getting all your pre-work done correctly. And that's often not what is happening. in that, managers say, people aren't doing what we want them to do. They're not behaving in the way we want them to behave. They're not doing the job in the way we want them to do it. So ultimately, their request is we want people to do their jobs better. We want them to do them differently. In other words, they want behaviour change. Now, even if it's for compliance reasons to tick some regulatory boxes, ultimately they still have to behave compliantly. We're still talking about behaviour. Even if you're putting the training in place for some kind of morale or engagement reasons, ultimately it's about behaviour change, about getting them to do their jobs better. It's all about doing their jobs better. It's about behaviour change. So we've got to get really good at defining, well, what is the current set of behaviours and what set of behaviours do we want to supplant them with and replace them with. And that work is seldom done upfront correctly. And so we end up delivering L&D initiatives just because someone has kind of popped out of their head a solution that they think might work, and away they go and deliver it. So I think, and that's where you start your learning transfer stuff. That's where you start figuring out you've got to do your behavioural stuff up first, your performance consultancy, if you like, before you ever do learning consultancy. They're two very different things, and people get them really confused and mixed up. It's frustrating. It really is. So, but we can dive into that if you want to go there. How do you feel about that, Nelson? That kind of
it's similar to what you were saying, Paul, and actually going back to our backgrounds outside of L&D and actually more kind of engineering and product. I think a product-led kind of approach where you are looking at a problem, and often it's a business or performance problem within the organization, and then you're trying to essentially put together a product that would meet that need and solve that problem. And if you were to take that approach, I think you often would take maybe a performance consulting approach rather than a learning needs or learning consultant, because you would essentially just seek out the best product for the problem, versus what tends to happen now is they've already decided on the product and now they're trying to find a problem to fit the product, right? And they're walking around with, we often see L&D teams who are walking around with a library of courses, finding a problem that they can, push a course out for, rather than the other way around. And I think that's where you tend to see a disconnect and a lack of engagement.
I think I've been amused recently at this rising up of the idea of design thinking, this 5-step process that is being sort of starting to kick around L&D. And the reason why it amuses me is that's exactly how I was taught to look at design when I was doing my engineering degree, whatever that was, more than 40 years ago. There's nothing new about it. But what it does do is what you've just said, is it tends to focus you on, well, let's define the problem first. Let's talk to the people who are experiencing that problem. Let's go and ideate. Let's get some ideas together on how we might solve it. Let's iterate that process, get to a minimum viable product that's going to do something, and then iterate that again, and so on. If we approached L&D in that way, and so I'm all for this design thinking coming into L&D, absolutely. But I think it's still often done where people are wearing a very learning and development hat, and they still have this idea that any solution is going to be a learning solution. So they're still doing what I would term learning consultancy, as opposed to going back to basics and doing what I term performance consultancy, which is saying, where is the performance going off the rails? How do we work with that performance? How do we decide what's there? How do we decide what we want instead? How do we bridge that gap? And performance is always about how people behave. So how do we deliver the new behaviours to people? And that's the question that we should be asking. How do we deliver behaviours to people, rather than how do we deliver learning to them, or some kind of L&D intervention, whatever that happens to be? And if we take that step back and say, how do we deliver behaviours? How do we do that reliably? How do we do it at scale, and so on and so forth? But of course, that means you've got to define your behaviours. And that's what I talked about a little bit earlier, is getting really good at defining what we mean by a behaviour, and then defining that behaviour in terms that can be observed. If you think of the way gymnasts would judge a gymnastics competition, or divers judging diving, or dance judges judging Strictly Come Dancing or something, they have in their mind a really detailed checklist of the different moves and how they should be executed. So they know behaviourally what they're looking for, and then they score a rating on that. So if if someone is looking at someone in an employee in a working situation, you need to develop that really detailed list of what would I see or hear or feel when they are doing things badly and when they are doing things well. Now, that's either going to be what I see them personally doing, or alternatively, what I see in terms of first order effects and from what they are doing. So, for example, thinking of, MasterChef, if we're going to look at these competitions, the cooking is done in the kitchen. The judges don't see them cooking, but they do see the first order effect of tasting the dish when it comes out. So there we're going beyond see or hear, or we're going into taste and smell now as well. So those 5 sensory things, how do we judge someone? And that then sets you up to measure those behaviours in a way that you can measure them as you produce them or not when you are trying to deliver those behaviours. And there are ways you can deliver the behaviours, which we can get into if you want to go there. But does that jibe with your experience, Nelson, in terms of that initial thinking?
Yeah, definitely, Paul. And I think the benefit of taking that approach is you don't leave measuring as an afterthought. Because when you take a performance-led approach, you're going to have to start by defining what is that baseline observation. Going back to your Strictly example, there's an observation of how they're doing their jump or turn right now, and then what the aspiration is in terms of what that B is, where are they trying to get to, and you can define that through the observations. And so the paradigm for measurement is kind of set up from the get-go, versus often what we see now, where we're kind of prescribing learning without having a well-defined measure of what kind of good or success looks like. And often when you do that as an afterthought, you find yourself trying to retrofit and you don't really get the kind of impact metrics to be able to demonstrate the value you're bringing. And I think this is going to become more and more of a challenge for L&D, looking ahead. The markets don't look strong, and it looks like we're heading into a recession, which will put essentially a spotlight on every function within the organization. But in particular, L&D and HR would have to justify their place and the resources and budget that they need. And for that, impact and measuring impact can't be an afterthought. It has to be from the get-go, you're observing and defining what point A is and what's the point B that you want to get to. And I think the approach you mentioned, Paul, definitely lends itself well to that.
Yeah, well, that's good. And those point A and point B have to be defined in behavioural terms, in my opinion. I call it a behavioural needs analysis, or a BNA, and that's where you need to start. And then you need to look at a barriers analysis or diagnostics to say, well, what's actually stopping the behaviours we want within the organisation? And very often it's not a learning problem. So there's a lot of stuff needs to happen before you even think about doing a learning needs analysis or anything to do with learning. And people often don't do that. The other thing about measurement that's really critical is that it's measured, the measurements are set up and reported on and presented and thought of as a way of how can we measure our progress towards our desired outcome. And then also, how can we measure it in such a way that we can improve the process we're using to get to that desired outcome? How can we iterate improvements within what we're producing and delivering? I think too often in L&D, there's this kind of mental mindset that I need to prove the worth of what we're doing so I can justify my paycheck each month. In other words, I need to show that L&D has an impact in order to justify L&D's existence in the organization, rather than I need to measure it so I can actually get better and deliver more.
Yeah.
And it's really subtle, that shift in mind. But what it does do is, if you're solely focused on how do I justify L&D's existence, the way you gather, the data you gather, what you do and how you present it will have a slant to it. And I think that's inherently not useful for the organization. What L&D should be doing is saying we're doing it so that we can get better at delivering against what you want in terms of behaviours. And given that you're accurate about the behaviours you want, that means the execution of the organisational strategy will take place with ease.
I think, like you said, Paul, I think often what we see they're kind of trying to prove their worth manifest into is L&D becoming a bit of a production facility, which is, the kind of quickest way to demonstrate value, or at least misconceive, is to just produce more. And so often that's why I think we find the L&D functions creating many courses or buying many courses, creating multiple programs and hosting classrooms, because production and producing things almost in itself is kind of perceived and positioned as value versus the behavior change or performance improvement it actually drives. And I think that's the mindset shift we'll have to see, because I think once you're looking at it and the business is reviewing spend and how budgets manage, it's less around how much output you're putting out and more about how effectively you're achieving the outcomes. And I think that shift from output to outcome is definitely one that would be useful for L&D teams.
The other interesting thing about that is, just imagine a big, mechanical engineering firm. I'm a mechanical engineer, so I can talk like that. There's the shop floor manager says, I want to buy a new computer-controlled lathe because it's going to have some benefits. We'll replace the old manual one. We'll replace it with a computer-controlled one. And he puts together, he or she, I should be open here, that manager puts together a business case to buy that computer-controlled machine. Might cost them £1 million. And ultimately, they're responsible for the return on investment that they invest in that new machine, not the company that sells it to them. So when that manager, quote unquote, buys L&D services from the L&D department, how come it's L&D's responsibility to prove the ROI? Surely that should be the manager. If you look at this, it's just a really interesting paradigm that if they buy a new machine, the manager has to deliver on the ROI, whereas if they buy training, somehow it's L&D's responsibility. I'm not saying it shouldn't be, it's just a really interesting difference.
It's probably more of a shared responsibility, isn't it? I think we spoke about this a little bit last time, Nelson, around stakeholders, but how can they build that mindset? Like we said, Paul explained we should move away from this sort of fear-based mindset and actually maybe something more collaborative, allows you to bring in the right people so that, like Paul points out, we can get past that barrier of like, this is an L&D separate thing. How can we create that shared mindset?
Yeah, I think, Paul, I don't know what your thoughts are on. I think the idea of L&D are the sole owners of your learning and performance improvement in the organization is a fallacy, right? And I think this idea of it's not effective. As an organization, you can't learn at the speed you need to learn if L&D are the only people taking responsibility. The reality is behavior change and performance improvement is everyone's responsibility, and definitely every people manager's responsibility within the organization. And I think if every person took responsibility for themselves and their self-directed learning and improvement, as well as managers taking responsibility for people in their team, then I think that element of shared ownership of each other's performance improvement is more likely to become a culture within the organization versus organizations where we've seen it's just the L&D who are kind of playing the drums and got a megaphone shouting about why we need to invest in L&D and performance improvement. It isn't enough if it's just L&D who are taking that responsibility and ownership. And so I think the shift is with each person taking ownership for themselves and their teams. What are your thoughts, Paul, on how to get that kind of collaborative mindset?
You talk of a utopian future, Nelson, which is wonderful. It's the holy grail of learning. Everybody being self-directed and being responsible and caring for each other. And I'm up for it, but I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow. I think over time, we have pretty much trained people to expect to be spoon-fed in most organizations in terms of their learning. I had the delightful experience once of talking to some very senior people at British Airways about spoon-fed learning. And I even said, and made aeroplane noises when I was waving the spoon around in the meeting. So it was years ago now. But that's what's happened is people expect it to be done to them. Managers expect L&D to do it to the people on their team and often don't have much expectation that they either want to or need to get involved. So yes, there's a big cultural shift needed there in the direction that you're talking about. And it's really interesting how the towards maturity, or what's now the Emerald stuff, actually talks about that shift in learning maturity through some different stages. That's well worthwhile, thinking through how do we shift how we deliver and operate with learning. But if you try and take people too fast towards what you're describing, they will react to that and dig their heels in. So what you've got to do is take them step by step towards that. And there are some ways of doing that where you start, don't just say leap from here where we're spoon feeding you across this great gap to over there, which is where you're self-directed and looking after yourself, albeit with some help and support. You've got to give them some sort of stepping stones along the way to cross that gap a little more easily. And you can do that. There are ways of doing that, particularly with what I call learning workflows. But, so I think it's really important that we acknowledge this gap. We acknowledge that ultimately that's where we'd like to have people, but that it's not a one step and leap tall buildings in one bound type of thing. We need to take people there gradually at a rate that they are prepared to go.
Yeah, I think something interesting that just came to my mind when we were going through these last two topics is they're really easy to do, I think, if you're starting from scratch, like a blank canvas, right? But if you've already committed to a certain initiative or strategy, how can you sort of course correct when it comes to, are we implementing these methods with behavioural change in mind, or is our mindset correct in terms of how, what we want people to expect from learning? Is there a way we can sort of course correct, or easy tips people, or not easy, but tips people could apply in that sense?
What do you think, Nelson?
Well, I would often apply the lean approach. And I think, again, there's a lot L&D can probably take from the lean philosophies that are now applied across multiple different disciplines. But the idea of, start small, think big, and really having that iterative feedback loop. So you may have been doing something in one way with big bang programs and a very kind of top-down approach. But the shift doesn't necessarily have to be a big shift and a jarring one. You could start by putting in place a small feedback loop that allows you to collect feedback, impact data, and use that data to start iterating. So I think the starting point could be as simple as building in a feedback loop. Often the challenge is there's a lot of time and effort and money that's spent up front, even before there's any kind of feedback or metrics that are sent back to the people who are investing in these resources. And so, if you spent 6 months building a training program only to find out that the day you launch it or after you launch it, there's not much engagement, the feedback is actually it doesn't cover what we need, it doesn't translate into performance improvement. Whereas you could have done something in 1 month with a much smaller audience to start to gather data and feedback and metrics to start iterating. And I often look at learning like a flywheel, and that feedback loop isn't linear. That feedback loop builds in momentum the more feedback and data you collect. And so it is more of a flywheel. And so the thing I'd suggest for organizations to do, if they're thinking about this shift, is by implementing a feedback loop and optimize themselves for collecting feedback as quickly as possible, to optimize the kind of rate at which they move towards the desired outcome. What are your thoughts, Paul?
Well, I think the feedback loop thing, what that takes me to is using Robert Brinkoff's success case method, or the SCM method, to look at improving the training. Very good methodology. And when you're looking at feedback, you're going to get a bell curve of results in a very simple terms. Look at the ends of the bell curve, not the middle, because the middle will give you very little useful information. Whereas if you look at people who have succeeded well as a result of the training program or not succeeded well, you will get much more rich information that will help you iterate and improve that course going forwards. The other thing that's really important is, before you even try and turn the flywheel, is actually get your basic information right, which means doing your early stage diagnostics right. One of the things you mentioned is I think I've seen something in the chat about relevance of information, where learners say, well, that's not relevant for me. So you've got to do that early diagnostics up front to get the different stakeholders involved, to look at what are the behaviours we want, but also what's stopping people doing those behaviours. Why would they want to do them anyway? And it's amazing how many times training courses are mooted as a solution to a problem where actually people already know most of what the training course is going to give them. It's just they're not doing it because there's some systemic or environmental issue which is stopping them from actually doing it in the real world. So you've got to do all that diagnostics up front. And I think it's really important that you have sort of performance consultants on the edge of your L&D function to act as a filter, so you don't get demands for learning coming straight into the L&D function, which then people in L&D say, oh, yes, we do learning and development. Let's do that. We'll deliver on that. And I'm very happy because someone wants their services. But actually, there's a whole step being missed out. And that's the step that will end up wasting lots and lots of L&D money in the way you've just described, where courses are put out there and then prove to have very little impact. And then the other thing you've got to think about is that question I asked earlier, how do we deliver behaviours? And that's in order to get the flywheel spinning so it's changing behaviour, you need to, again, get that first question does, how do we deliver those behaviours? And the only way you're going to do that, if you think about it, is, and that means we're delivering effective L&D. Because if it's not going to change behaviour, your L&D is just not effective. So if you want to generate sustained behaviour change, you've got to make sure that change you generate becomes embedded, it becomes a habit, it becomes the way we do things around here, it becomes part of the cultural norm, if you like. Now, this is not going to happen in a vacuum. Pretty much always when you want someone to change the way they're doing something, it's because they're already doing it a certain way. So you're replacing an existing habit, if you want to call it that, with another one. That's not necessarily an easy thing to do. You're never going to do that in an event-based approach. You're always going to have a number of activities people take over a period of time to practice, experiment, learn a bit more of whatever they need to do to change the way they do things sustainably and repeatably over time. So it becomes the new habit, the new cultural norm. So it's pretty good. We need to get defining what they're doing now, what they need to do instead, which we talked about before, designing in observable and sensory terms, and then thinking, well, who's done that journey? How did they do it? What steps did they go through to get from where they were to where they are now, the exemplars of the good behaviour? And then you have to design a sequence of activities over time to deliver to those people in order to deliver that new behaviour. I call that a learning workflow, because if it's a sequence of activities delivered over time, designed to achieve a specific outcome, that's the definition of a workflow. And so let's call it a learning workflow. I've been using that term for years, since one of my books, I put it out in there. So that's the way you can deliver effective learning, is a learning workflow, which is a sequence of activities. It's a bit like the sat-nav. When you punch your destination to your sat-nav, you get a set of step-by-step instructions. You know that given the instructions are good, and they will be if they've been designed well by Google's AI or whatever, if you follow them, you're going to get to your destination. You don't really have an option. L&D is the same. If you know what the destination is and those well-defined, observable criteria for the behaviours you want, if you design a workflow, a number of steps that will get them through the things they have to do to get from where they are to being able to repeat that behaviour in the work, in the day-to-day work, and you hold them accountable for following those steps, you are guaranteed to get that behaviour change.
Yeah.
Guaranteed behaviour change. What's not to like about that? But you need a learning workflow to do that. And quite frankly, so few people think of learning in terms of a workflow or a program over time. They too often still think of it as an event-based, one-off type thing, a once-and-done thing. That's never going to change behaviour. Never did, never will. Sorry.
Yeah. Paul, you made a good point there about the chat. So we do have one question that's already come in. And if anyone else wants to ask a question, please pop it in the chat now, because I'll ask Nelson a quick follow-up question before we get to those. But we also spoke before, Nelson, about loaded assumptions. And we sort of spoke about the tools people use when they make assumptions, but also people sometimes make assumptions about the behavior they want to change as well, right? So L&D needs to dig a bit deeper sometimes in this performance consultant kind of way and say, why is this the behavior that needs to change? Do you agree? Is that something people should do a bit more? How can they do that?
They should do a lot more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's incredible how much gets invested in terms of time, resources, how much gets created in organizations without actually speaking to the end customer. I mean, if we were doing that as a business, you wouldn't get away with it. For kind of building something without talking to customers is one of the biggest risks you can have as a product company. And which is the same for an internal customer. You know, why would you not speak to an internal customer? I mean, not only is it a great opportunity to get to know more people in your organization and go across function, but you're essentially speaking to the people who you're trying to essentially add value to and help change their behavior and improve their performance. And I think the approach to this, like Paul mentioned, there's definitely techniques and approaches from a performance consulting. But I think even as a baseline, starting a great technique that I talk about is kind of customer discovery interview process, just an interview, right? Really trying to understand the problem better, like the business problem, but also the performance challenges, and then understanding the context and the variables at play when this person has experienced these problems. You know, where factors like their environment, you know, is it a dark environment? Is it a loud environment? Really understanding those physical contexts, but also understand the cultural context. You know, do they have the psychological safety to practice what they've learned? Do they have the mechanism in place for getting feedback? And so by asking those questions to your internal customer, you can gather the data that you need to inform maybe the learning workflow that you put together. And so definitely not enough of that happens. And it's a very easy one to overcome.
And then I could just go and get my second book, the one with the red cover, which talks about that whole diagnostics process.
There you go. The content's already out there. We'll have to link Paul's book in the email now as well. So perfect. We can move now to a couple of questions that came through in the chat. So I'll try and summarize this one from Sanford. It's a bit of a long one, but I think it's quite an interesting point. So it's around the expectations that people have around learning. And now that if it doesn't solve a problem and it doesn't start to do that quickly, then people lose interest and the sort of learning cycle ends. Sanford sort of likens it to Netflix, where we'll watch 1 or 2 episodes, and if it doesn't, hook us, then we're bailing out. Rather than sort of, how can we do this more effectively at the same time, taking into account how people learn naturally? So I think that's sort of the gist of the question. How do we make sure we're giving people value quick enough that they see the importance of continuing to learn, but also facilitating sort of this accidental, organic type of learning?
Okay, that comes from your initial performance diagnostics process. What you've got to be, one of those is relevance. There's a number of levers about learning transfer put together by Dr. Ina Weinbauer-Heidel. I've worked with her on a few occasions, and we've shared the stage at various conferences. So you could get a hold of her book that talks about those 12 levers. It's actually, which are reproduced in that ebook of mine as well, by the way, so you can also grab the details from there. But one of those levers is relevance. If a learner does not feel that what they have been given to learn is relevant to them, they are going to bail very, very quickly. So at the very early stages of your whole process, you need to get those stakeholders involved, which is what Nelson was talking about earlier, and make sure that you understand their kind of what's in it for me, how, why do I even want to bother learning this? Is this useful for me? And also the way I'm being asked to learn it, does that suit the way that I want to go about doing things? I don't want to sit in the classroom. I'd rather just have a document on it, or I'd rather talk to colleagues about it, or I'd rather talk to an experienced, subject matter expert or whatever. There's all sorts of different ways that someone might seek to learn that. They might want a bit of e-learning. They might not want a bit of e-learning. So how can you figure out sort of generally how people want to learn something and also what to them is relevant to learn? That relevance is extremely important. It's one of the first things you have to get right. Otherwise, the learners will bail and you're on a hiding to nothing from that point on. Now, it might be relevant and they might not realize it. So also it's the way you market it to them. You have to market the relevance to them if they feel it's not relevant. So it's their perception of its relevance that counts, not the reality of that relevance. The perception of the learner is really, really important. So the way that you start putting calls to action together to those learners to get them doing things, to get them doing the tasks and the learning workflow and the activities is really important. I tend to lean on the work of BJ Fogg from Stanford in that area. And that's another whole webinar based around that, the call to action, the choice architecture you use to nudge people to do the activities they need to do to get the behaviours that you want them to develop. I don't know whether that answers the question, but I think it goes part way anyway.
Yeah, I think so. And Nelson, any thoughts you wanted to add around this sort of concept?
Yeah, just to really highlight what Paul said around what's in it for them. And often when you don't get engagement and they feel it's irrelevant, it's often because it's not been understood what they're going to get out of this, and therefore they're not engaging with the material. So often the mistake L&D make here is they go back to investing more money in creating more interactive, quote on fun content, and they just assume it has to be the content. And so it becomes a kind of vicious cycle of pumping in more resources into creating more content or more interactive content, etc., rather than actually digging in to gather that feedback again. It's taking an iterative feedback loop to speak to the customers, to actually understand what is it? What was being covered? Was that helpful to the problem? Did they apply it? Did they not apply it? If they didn't, why didn't they apply it? Maybe they did apply it and actually it didn't help them solve the problem, in which case you need to go back and change what you're covering. But I think that feedback loop of gathering, rather than, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all hypothesis here that's all of a sudden going to create engaging content for everyone, but it's to gather that data and to use that data to inform how you deliver relevant content to people in their moment of need. And so it's not just around the relevance of the learning, but also taking into account their context and the moment at which they're going to need this learning. And so, yeah, building on what Paul's suggestion is, I'd definitely say building in that feedback loop again and gathering that data to understand what's working and what's not working. And the people who are using it, really understanding why are they finding value in it versus others are not. And leveraging that data to kind of double down on the things that are working and cut back on the things that are not.
Yeah, definitely. We actually have a sort of follow-up question from Sanford as well, which is around, in organizations that have been successful in changing their behavior when it comes to learning and training, sort of how have they done it? What have you seen? And is there any best practices you can both share with us? Maybe Paul, if you want to share your thoughts.
Given the time, that's a long answer, but a very quick one. There is certainly one customer that we have, a training company, that is delivering and has delivered for quite a large number of years a mid to senior leadership program into a large government department. And they were running 150 to 200 delegates a year through this program. Prior to the pandemic, it was always done face-to-face in the classroom. I think it was 6 days over about 3 months. Obviously, with the pandemic, they switched to digital. They put it onto our platform and delivered it virtually, again, over about 6 months, but it was very much an iterative process. And they did start looking at it like a learning workflow and a number of activities. The customer noticed that they were getting far more reliable behaviour change from the delegates with the virtual program than they ever did from the face-to-face program in previous years. Pretty much identical content, just delivered differently. And so they just basically said, never go back to the classroom. So now, even though they could go back to the classroom, they've decided not to, and they're still delivering it this year digitally on our platform. So there's a particular place where they have gone to this learning workflow type approach and away from a classroom approach, just because it is working better. And yes, the results are somewhat anecdotal within that organization, but that anecdotal evidence is very, very consistent across large numbers of users.
Yeah.
I'm happy to talk about the design of some of those things, perhaps offline later. It's a much bigger topic than we've obviously got time for in these last few minutes.
Yeah, agreed.
So just to kind of quickly add to that as well, it is a big question, but there's definitely a couple of areas of focus. One is really asking the question of, does it matter how many hours people are learning? If someone does 100 hours of learning, but you're not seeing any material improvement in performance or solving that problem, And because when you optimize for driving more learning engagement and time, you optimize for essentially people trying to game the system, right? I just want to show activity, but actually I'm no longer looking at it to see if it solves a problem for me. So I would maybe look at changing, organizations I've seen this do this really well, is they've shifted the narrative around what they're doing. And the narrative is really around better performance, which everyone can get behind, right? The business can get behind, the employee can get behind, because they're both vested in performing better because their interests are aligned. And so I think shifting the narrative and seeing learning as almost not the end, but the means to an end, and having that shift in the organization, I've seen it work really well. Then other more things around how you approach learning, definitely more curation. And I think L&D not feeling the burden of having to create everything and being the gatekeeper, and more the kind of enablers and setting the guidelines for how curation can be done at scale across the organization, so you get more relevant content within the organization. And knowledge sharing, right? I think a really untapped opportunity within organizations is tapping into your internal experts. Not only is the content more likely to be relevant, but there's an element of social proof because it's coming from a peer or colleague that I work with, who's being recognized for their expertise. Again, drives a lot of engagement. And what we found across How Now is content that's created internally and shared from colleagues gets far more engagement than often your kind of structured courses that get pushed top down or bought in. There's obviously a bunch of other things, but there are a few things to kind of throw out there.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Nelson. Like you both alluded to there, we are coming towards the end of the show, so maybe something to pick up later. But to let everyone know, if they want to find Paul's ebook in the short term before we send out the email, you can go to paul-matthews.com. If you're listening to this on your podcast stream or YouTube, it'll be linked in the description. Hopefully the session was really useful for everyone today, and we'll be back again in a couple of weeks with another installment of L&D Disrupt Live. So make sure you're following Nelson and How Now on and Paul, obviously, on LinkedIn, so that you can be aware of the next session and any more interesting stuff Paul's got coming up. But Paul, thanks for joining us today, and really good conversation. I'm sure people found a lot of value in it.
You're very welcome. Thanks for the opportunity. And if anybody wants to link up on LinkedIn and ask any further questions, they are very, very welcome. I'm always happy to have a chat about L&D with anybody that's prepared to talk with me.
Awesome.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks a lot, Paul.
Thank you.